It's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome our next speaker, Professor John Haldane, who has recently been appointed Professor of Philosophy of Education at the Australian Catholic University, where he will lead an important Catholic educational, cultural and social project in partnership with the Archdiocese of Melbourne and Catholic Education Melbourne. A long-time visitor and popular speaker in Australia, Professor Haldane is a prolific researcher in philosophy, ethics, aesthetics, educational theory and theological issues, and has published many books and articles on philosophical, social and religious topics. For the past 5 years, Professor Haldane has held the J. Newton Razor Senior Distinguished Chair in Philosophy at Baylor University in Texas. He has taught at the University of St Andrews since 1983, holding several senior positions, including Director of the Centre for Ethics, Philosophy and Public Affairs. John was going to be one of our keynote speakers at the conference in Melbourne this year, and so we're very grateful that he's been able to join us live from Scotland at what is a very unenviable hour of the morning over there. Good morning and welcome, Professor Haldane, and we look forward to your reflections.
Thank you very much indeed, Leanne. Thank you to Jacinta and thank you to all of those who've been involved in the organisation and arrangements for this event. I am indeed pleased and grateful to be able to be with you. I'm sorry, however, that I'm not able to be with you in person. I was very much looking forward to that. Indeed, as Leanne just said, I'm speaking to you from St Andrews. Had things gone according to plan, I would have come to Australia at the end of July. But of course, in the current situation, that wasn't possible. And I just hope that I can get there as soon as possible in the new year, because I'm very keen to be talking with people in Australia about education, but I also just love it. It's such a wonderful, wonderful and exciting country. And unlike Europe, it doesn't feel culturally exhausted. At any rate, so I'm going to be speaking as a philosopher, and that might already send shivers of terror into some of you, or you may think that this is going to go on for a very long time. It won't, but of course, in the need to be brief, I'm also going to have to speak in headlines, as it were, rather than in a smaller print. That's to say, I'm going to be highlighting some issues which, of course, themselves need much more articulation and elaboration. The general title, Faith in the Future, as I was considering that, the first thing that struck me about it, and I don't know whether this was intended, is a certain ambiguity in it. Because it might mean belief or confidence in the future, you might say faith in the future, or it might be speculation about where faith will stand in the future, what will be the place of faith in the future. Now, these two interpretations of the general title, the one that says, belief or confidence in the future, and the other one, speculation or thinking about where faith will be in the future, to some extent might be in tension, because you might think that what we know about the development of religion and the development of the world over the last, say, 2 or 3 centuries would give us some reason to be pessimistic about the future of faith, that we live in an age of increasing secularization and that the sea of faith, as the poet put it, is ebbing out across the sands. And that reflection, if one felt that, would certainly undermine the first idea, the idea of belief or confidence in the future. Now, I think to address that, first of all, what I want to say something about just very briefly is the distinction between optimism and hope. Optimism is an attitude of expectation of success. The optimistic person is somebody who thinks that things are going to go well. Now, you might think that optimism and hope are the same thing, but they're not at all, and particularly if we're speaking of hope as a theological virtue. Some years ago, I remember having a conversation with the chief rabbi of the time, Jonathan Sachs, who said to me, John, one thing that you Catholics must learn or recall, remember from your teaching, is something that we Jews know very well, which is the distinction between optimism and hope. No Jew has reason to be optimistic, but every Jew, every believing Jew, has reason to be hopeful. Because, of course, the Jew has hope, as indeed the Christian does, in God and in God's providential purpose and aims. But it doesn't follow from being hopeful in God that one would be optimistic about human affairs, as it were, left to themselves. So the first thing I want to say is this, that if we're going to have faith in the future, cognizant of the trends that have gone on in recent centuries, we need to understand that that faith is going to have to be based fundamentally in hope, not in optimism, and a hope in Jesus Christ and in the promises given by Christ. But that doesn't mean that things are necessarily going to go terribly well round about here, wherever here may be. But that's not meant to be a pessimistic message. It's one that holds on to hope, but it doesn't hold on to any kind of foolish or kind of wistful optimism. I think that things are difficult, and there's no reason to think they aren't going to continue to be difficult, and in some respects are going to get worse. Some years ago, I used to write a monthly column for the London Times newspaper, and my experience was that whenever I wrote on sort of cheery matters, for the most part, people would say, "Oh, I saw your article the other day," but they didn't really produce much of a sort of engagement with that. But whenever I touched on troublesome matters, this would produce what was there originally a significant mailbag, in a sense, actually, of letters sent on to me by the newspaper. But once people knew my email address, a large email postbag, as it were. And I was reminded of a saying of the American author Thoreau: "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." Now, I don't think that's necessarily true, but what is true is that beneath the face to the world, or behind the face to the world, is the reality of the human condition. And the reality of the human condition, for a child, for an adult, for an older person, is often a troubled reality. And I think that when one speaks to that, when one sort of acknowledges and recognizes and shares with others that, this is a great moment or opportunity, I think, for progress in thinking about and talking about and trying to address the human condition. And in writing these monthly columns over a period of about 4 years, I sort of developed a kind of, well, not really a formula, but an abiding thought that I return to from time to time. And I'll just really sort of quote it now to begin with, and then I want to come back to it briefly at the end. And it's this. In one of these columns, I think I wrote, "We come into a world not of our own making, under conditions we did not choose, in circumstances over which we have little control." We come into a world not of our own making, under conditions we did not choose, in circumstances over which we have little control. And this seems to me is true. That's why I said it. But actually, in a way, it speaks to us in these present times, because, of course, you might have thought that one might have felt, particularly people, say, born in the last 20 years, might have felt that they've come into a world in which the circumstances of it are very much under our control through technology and advanced developments of various sorts and so on. And yet here we are in the midst of COVID, and we suddenly are reminded of the uncertainties and the vulnerabilities of the human condition. As I say, we come into a world not of our own making, under conditions we didn't choose, in circumstances over which we have little control. So I want to, having said that 3 times now, I want to return to it yet once more in a little while. But let me turn now just to talk about the challenges for Catholic education as we proceed further in this century. It seems to me that these are broadly of 4 sorts, and here I will have to be really quite brief. The 4 sorts are sociological, psychological, intellectual or philosophical, and spiritual. So sociological, psychological, if you like, philosophical, and spiritual. The sociological challenge comes with something that we're already quite familiar with, which is the weakening of the traditional triangular structure of home, school, and church. Now, these in the past were mutually reinforcing, just like a geometrical figures, where the sides supported one another, and the points that met, the points where the sides met, were reinforced by that structure. Now, what of course has happened, and we know this, has been a kind of decline in these individual points and sides. So the decline of the nuclear or conjugal family, it's not just that this is, in ways that are very familiar to us, has been reduced and weakened, but an aspect of it that's significant and not so often discussed perhaps, it was the intergenerational structure of the nuclear family, the fact that there were grandparents perhaps literally in the home, or certainly not very far from it, because people tended to live closer together then. But also there was an expectation of children coming along in each generation. And this has changed. It's a marked feature of recent times, something that even has a name, antinatalism, the idea that having children is a bad thing. Now, whether you think that or not, it is those of you who are teachers of, say, teenagers in school will be aware of the fact that increasingly people are saying they're not necessarily going to have children. So the whole idea of the family is radically changing and challenged. The church itself, which I don't really need to kind of elaborate on that, but some of you who are old enough will remember a situation in which the church was perhaps literally a parish was served by a parish priest, additional curates, there were members of religious orders around and about. There was the whole structure of societies and associations, altar boys and others, all associated with the church. That's largely gone. And then again, in the context of the schools have become much more diverse. There's less of the intergenerational community that there was in schools. So these three components have been individually transformed, and in the process of their transformation, there's been a weakening of the bonds between them. The psychological, under the psychological heading of the challenges posed by that, there's been a shift in the consciousness of Catholics and the Church more generally from a kind of triumphalism, or certainly a great deal of self-confidence, from that to accommodation to the world. The triumphalism saw the Church as something sort of set apart from and in a way above the world, but accommodation to the world and increasingly to despair in the face of the world. And there are all sorts of factors that have gone into that. The institutional situation of the church, the crisis of clergy abuse, the hierarchical failures, all of these have contributed to a loss of confidence in the church. The accommodations have come with the increasing pressure as there are changes in the modes and morals and mores of the world. Around sexual ethics, around marriage, around issues of life and death, abortion, euthanasia, and so on. And in the on the spiritual side, there's been a shift away from the sort of traditional pietistic and ascetic religious practices to other forms of engagement, or indeed to no forms of engagement. On the philosophical side, there's a kind of loss of the practice of Catholic apologetics. Older generations were familiar with popular presentations often of arguments for the existence of God, and then for proceeding more precisely to the truth of the revelation of the incarnation and the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, and then through to the authority of the church. That has largely disappeared from Catholic presentations. And then under the spiritual heading, what we've got is a shift from a strong emphasis that characterizes spirituality in earlier periods on interiority towards a kind of externalized forms of spirituality. So the older form of spirituality was highly personalistic and emphasized the interior journey towards God. Now we have forms of spirituality that are oriented outwards, whether to others or to nature. Now, in response to this, how might one proceed? Well, it seems to me there are four prospects. One is restorationism, and we see that on the part of some groups. It has a representation in Australia, but not a very large or significant one. In the United States, this is much more marked. These restorationist groups who really, they have a kind of austere denunciation of the contemporary world, and they want to somehow get back to an earlier state of affairs, an earlier stage of things. The second response is what I call romantic affirmation. This is gentler than the restorationism. It doesn't simply denounce the world, but it somehow tries to create imaginatively a sort of gentler recreation of an imagined golden past. The third response is what I might call a recreational pick and mix relationship to religion, that people see religion as part of their lives, but not a dominant part, and they take from it the bits, as and when they take from it the bits that are, whether they're sentimentally attached to or they're convenient at the time or whatever else it may be. And those of school teachers will be familiar with this attitude as represented often by parents. And then the fourth response is what I call that of reform and renewal. And that's the one that I'm concerned with, engaged with, not just now, but I mean, not just in the project with the Archdiocese of Melbourne and the Australian Catholic University, but really in my writings over the last three decades, I've been concerned with this issue of reform and renewal. Now, let me just then turn briefly, having spoken about the challenges and the sort of general possibilities of response, let me say something about the opportunities presented by the current times for a reform and renewal of the presentation of Catholic thought and practice within the home, within the school, within the church, I mean the parish church. Well, the opportunities come with certain features of the current cultural condition of the world, as it were. 25 or 30 years ago, there was a wide-scale rejection by intellectuals of what they like to call metanarratives. Metanarratives were really sort of overarching accounts or stories of the human condition. And those were associated very much with religious and philosophical conceptions, and it was felt that we now have outgrown those. But in fact, and this shows you how quickly things can change, what was rejected 25 years ago has been rediscovered. Today, there are two overarching meta-narratives, and they're in competition with one another. One is the search for, the craving for identity. And this you'll be familiar with in a whole variety of ways, whether it's ethnic identities, the identity of cultural heritage, the sexual identities, identities of gender, and so on and so on. That's one meta-narrative, that people are now looking for an account of themselves and who they are that's given by their sexual identity or their cultural identity or their heritage and so on and such like. This is very much an answer to the question, who am I? And the problem with it, I would say, I mean, it's not that who am I is a bad question, but the problem with it in the form in which it's become dominant is it's disassociative. It actually breaks down the connections between people because it becomes an assertion of individual identity and often inclines to a kind of narcissism, a celebration of oneself as something special to be celebrated without, as it were, regard to the condition or reality of others' lives. And the second meta-narrative that's become prominent is quite unlike the first, individual identity one. It's actually an abandonment of human identities in favor of a kind of pantheistic environmentalism. So that instead of, as we're looking upon to find truth and meaning in oneself, one looks out towards the world. Now, the problem with that second perspective is that it's led to a kind of diminution of the status of the human being. So, how to proceed in the face of all of that? Well, I go back to what I said before about coming into a world not of our own making, under conditions we didn't choose and circumstances over which we have little control. What goes along with that is the knowledge, however, of the tremendous resources that human beings have for making sense of themselves and of the world. And these are resources that individuals of great creative genius have, but they belong to cultures as well, and they're embodied in traditions, and specifically, as far as we are concerned, in religious traditions, and in a particular religious tradition, the Christian one, and yet more precisely, the Catholic one. What this speaks to is a longing for self-understanding. Augustine in the Confessions writes, we come into a world not of our own, Augustine writes, you made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they come to rest in you. There is a kind of restlessness that we recognize in ourselves. And to some extent, the growth of identity theory, the growth of environmentalism are connected with this restlessness, this quest for some kind of significance or meaning. Now, what Catholicism offers, and of course this has to be articulated at different levels and in different ways, is a kind of ennobling account of the human condition. It raises us up, but not in a reality-denying way. It's part, as it were, of the greatness of this vision, that it can recognize our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses. We can speak here in terms of sin, if we like, but as well the brokenness of human beings, but also recognize that a correct understanding of that brokenness points to the possibility of the healing of it. And this brings me back to hope, because hope is, or the hope that we're concerned with if we're speaking religiously, is a hope in God, that God, in cooperation with God, we can be healed. So what I want then just finally really to say is this, that we are faced with a large number of intellectual, cultural, sociological challenges. In regarding those, there is some reason to be pessimistic about the future of religion, the future of the Catholic Church. But set against that human pessimism is the religious virtue of hope. And that hope, as it's expressed and articulated in the Catholic vision, is one that brings together an understanding of our vulnerabilities, our limitations, our brokenness, but connects them with a source of strength, a source of illumination that can take us on that journey to God, whether it's in part an interior journey, a mystical journey, but it's also externally a community journey. And the places in which that journey is carried forward are the home, are the church, but increasingly and very importantly, as each of those institutions, those other institutions has been weakened, is the school. And school teachers are the primary agents of that kind of apostolic mission of evangelization, of bringing the gospel in a narrative that is ennobling of children's understanding of themselves and takes their problems and offers those problems an analysis and also a solution in and through the Christian virtue of hope. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Haldane. Wonderful reflections and insights to share with us this morning. We have one question that's come through already, and I'll ask that of you, and then we can move to any others that come through. So the question is, for the relationship between the church, schools and family, homes have to be strengthened. Doesn't that mean that all three need to be renewed? Do you have one priority for each of the three, or should they have a common priority?
Very good. Sorry, I'm being heard, am I? Yes. Good. Well, that's a good question. Certainly, I think that for all that the traditional triangular formation has become weakened, it remains important. There are difficulties, of course, because one thing that has developed in recent years is the idea of autonomy of these different spheres. And so people are rather anxious about anything that challenges one from the source of the other. So people are very concerned about the idea that the home life is challenged from some external source, or that the church might challenge it, or the school might challenge it, or that the school might be challenged by the church, and so on. So each is rather sort of protective of its own sphere of operation. But we have to find some way of connecting them, reconnecting them, as it were. And I think that the reconnecting, the thread that might tie them together, is this common endeavor of trying to tell again the fundamental story of creation, of fall, and of recovery. One of the beautiful ideas, I mentioned St. Augustine a moment ago in the Confessions, one of the beautiful ideas that St. Augustine offers is the idea of a recapitulation of the creation narrative in the lives of individuals. So what Augustine is saying is something like this, There is, as it were, the big story that applies cosmically, and that's the story of creation, fall, restoration. But that story we find played out in our own lives. That, as it were, we find ourselves as created beings. We're beings in the world, not of our own making. So in that sense, we're creatures. But going through that business of, as it were, stumbling, falling, picking up again, or being picked up by others and such like. Now, that recurrent narrative, that simple story, is one that can be told again and again in different modes, in different forms, in different places, within church, within school, and within the home. And I think that there is a sort of prospect here for a kind of cooperative project of quite literally talking between these different constituencies about ways in which that narrative can be articulated and the production of materials suitable for each, in which that idea of Augustine's that the cosmological or the cosmic narrative is played out in the lives of individuals. And what's very important about that is that it enables us to understand ourselves, because the story, as it were, of the Hebrews and of their breach of covenant with God and the restoration of covenant, and then the final restoration in Christ, which is a restoration of a covenant not just with the Hebrews, but with all mankind, is something that can be told at the level of one's individual experience, where people have, for example, been breached in their relationships through their own failings and the search for restoration. And this isn't just, as it were, a psychological trope or pattern. It is a deep theological insight into the human condition. So I would say there's a unifying idea, and it's one that can be expressed in each of those places, but by reference to its being expressed in each of the others.
Thank you. This question probably builds a little on what you've just been sharing with us. What do you see are the essential elements of educating for hope? So this is specifically for teachers, educating our young people for hope.
Yes. Well, I think that the first thing in doing that is to return to what I began with, really, the distinction between hope and optimism. I think it's foolish and a cheat to give people a sort of endlessly optimistic view of the world. I think this is one of the defects, actually, in progressivism, the idea that somehow every day in every way things are getting better, being on the right side of history and all this sort of stuff, that somehow this is optimism. And really, there's no ground for optimism. I mean, some things go well, some things go badly. We can see how very quickly things are turned around, as in the course of the past year with COVID and so on. So I think that the first thing is to distinguish between optimism and hope, and then think about what hope is. And hope is an essentially religious notion. Where one has hope, something that is difficult but not impossible is offered or lies before us. Difficult but not impossible. And the difficulty of achieving it is addressed in part by looking to one's own resources, but there we see the limitations of human fallibility, vulnerability, and so on, but then looking beyond ourselves to the way in which God assists in that. And the story then becomes a story of grace. And so part of the story that has to be told here is how it is that God graciously extends this gift of assistance to us. So I think that's how I would be. First of all, we're not talking about optimism. We're talking about the attainment of something that is not impossible, but is difficult, and which we realize we cannot attain and retain securely by ourselves. And so therefore we look to find a source that makes it possible, with which we can cooperate. And that becomes the whole story of cooperation with grace. And it's a story that can be told in biblical form, in various narratives through scripture, both Hebrew and Christian scripture. And it's one that can be told in the lives of saints. It's one that can be told in the lives of people today, and so on. It's very easy to illustrate that story, actually.
Thank you. This next question probably would be the topic of a whole presentation, but if in the couple of minutes we have left, if you could share just a couple of thoughts. How do you see the connection between evangelization and catechesis within our schools, and what does this mean for teacher professional learning?
That's a small question. Thank you very much indeed. I think that the term catechesis is sometimes used in different ways. I think of it as to be distinguished from religious education on the one hand, and perhaps even from religious instruction. I see catechesis as a part of a spiritual formation, a religious formation, an inculcation of the values and virtues of a religious tradition, not just verbally, but through practice and so on. So it's the forming and shaping throughout one's whole life. So catechesis is something that can go on at all and every stage. Now, evangelization, I think, is obviously bringing the gospel to people. And these two things, as it were, go together. I mean, there's a priority to evangelization because, first of all, one has, as it were, to have the good news. And then I see catechesis as the process of forming one's life and the lives of others in the light of that good news. So catechesis is really about acquiring a demeanor. This is the way I would put it, a way of being in the world that is informed by what evangelization brings to one. So the message of the gospel shapes one, or one's assisted in it shaping one, to be in the world in a certain way. So I think of these as sort of stages in a process of formation that leads to a demeanor, a way of being in the world. And by the way, let me just say this, that the importance of teachers as witnesses requires that they themselves manifest that demeanor. One of the things that I would say that challenges the church in the present day, in contrast with the way in which we thought about it in the past, sometimes our thoughts were illusions, is sanctity, the existence of saints. Now, you know, there's nothing more transformative in people's lives than a personal encounter with somebody whose life is the living of the truth. So it's a very great challenge, of course, but I think teachers especially have that responsibility, not just to evangelize in a verbal sense, not just to catechize in certain procedural ways, but to be witnesses if that gospel and that formation is to be authentic and effective.
Thank you very much, Professor Haldane. There are more questions, but we unfortunately don't have time to get to them. So thank you to those who sent them through, and apologies I haven't had time to read them out. Thank you again, Professor Haldane. It's been wonderful hearing from you this morning. We certainly look forward to welcoming you in person whenever our borders open. You're most welcome here in sunny Brisbane, where it's nearly 30 degrees today, so probably a contrast to where you are. But thank you for sharing your reflections, and I'm sure people will be now enthused and encouraged to go and look at some of your writings and that are available in the broader perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.